What is up, guys? Welcome to another edition of the Fundamental Health Podcast. If you like to hear this podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that's awesome. If you like to visualize this podcast and you're wondering about YouTube, YouTube censored us for something silly after the Jamie Seaman podcast, and they have not reinstated us despite their rules. So go to Rumble, RUMBLE, and search Paul Saladino. You will find all of the videos that go along with this podcast on Rumble for who knows how long. Censorship is super freaking frustrating. Like I said, YouTube should have reinstated us by now many weeks ago, and they have broken their own rules. There's no one that holds them accountable. This is how it works today. Okay. I want to tell you guys about all the cool stuff happening at Heart and Soil. This is my grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised company. I so believe in the benefits of organs, and I know deeply that you will benefit from having these in your diet. Listen to this review from Joseph W. He says, it may sound weird, but it is what it is. I'm 35 years old. I struggled with irritable bowel syndrome for decades. From the minute I started taking the beef organ supplement, my bowel movements have significantly improved. My stomach feels significantly better all around on a daily basis. I cannot recommend Heart and Soil supplements enough. Super stoked. How cool is that, you guys? There's so many reviews that we get like this all the time at Heart and Soil. So many people benefiting from organs. If you need more organs in your life, check us out at heartandsoil.co. We are all about helping you reclaim your birthright to radical health. My guest on today's podcast is Andy Mant. He is the CEO of BLUBlox, a company that sponsors this podcast from time to time for blue light blocking glasses. Although this is not a sponsored podcast, Andy is also an expert on light and stuff. So I wanted to have him on to talk about light. We've never really done a deep dive on light in this podcast, but it's a fascinating topic. Living here in Costa Rica, there is a clear benefit to being around natural sunlight for vitamin D and paying a lot of attention to my circadian rhythms. We go into all of it in this podcast with Andy. I think you will really enjoy this one about light and all that other good stuff. If you like this podcast and you want to have more people benefit from hearing this podcast like you did or have, please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this podcast. But if you leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, I will select one person every month and send them a signed copy of my book as a thank you for leaving me a review on Apple Podcasts. This helps us reach more people, which is ultimately what I'm all about with Heart and Soil, desiccated organs, with the podcast, with everything. We just want to share ideas that will help you live a better life and help you cultivate fundamental health. That's why I named it that. See what I did there? And on to today's podcast with Andy Mant, all about light. You guys are going to love this one. Andy, thanks for coming on the podcast, my friend. It's good to have you here.
Yeah, appreciate it, Paul. Thank you so much for having me on.
You know, I've been living in Costa Rica for the last 3 months, and being at the 9th latitude makes me think a lot about light. So it's cool to do this podcast with you because I haven't done any formal podcast on blue light and red light and circadian rhythms and sleep. So hopefully we'll be able to share a lot of good information with people. If anyone is watching this on YouTube, you can tell that I am extremely tan from living at the 9th latitude and loving all of the ultraviolet, full spectrum, non-junk light here in Costa Rica. But I thought we could just start there, Andy, because this is an interesting concept that I think you'll be able to speak to very well. What is this idea of junk light? Maybe let's just start with light in general, or tell us what junk light is, and then we'll back up and talk about what light is and why it's important to maybe get a full spectrum of light.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because to the layman you say I'm looking tanned, but to the expert on light, you've got a really healthy level of melanin going on, which is fantastic. We can talk more about that later. But yeah, it's really interesting that the term junk light has really come to the forefront of a lot of people's thinking and talking in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and they've started to become sort of released a lot of studies on the various sort of downsides to junk light as well. But let me just explain, I guess, the difference, because there's 2 types of light. There's actually natural light, which is really good for you, like the sunlight in the sky, and the moon and the stars can also provide good level of sort of monthly rhythm control as well. And then you've got like firelight as well in the evenings, which is this sort of warm red, orange glowing light, which is great for your sleep and unwinding after a day. But you've also got something called junk light, and it all started, back in the sort of 1800s with Thomas Edison, Nicholas Tesla, and they invented artificial lighting. So they harnessed the power of electricity and created a form of light. But as time went on, over the next sort of 100 years, we decided to change a lot of artificial lighting in its spectrum and its the type of colors that it was emitting, to the point where we found ourselves in the sort of mid to late 90s, where we moved away from these original incandescent bulbs to these in blue light, which later becomes a real problem for the circadian. Artificial light doesn't just extend to artificially created light. Junk light doesn't just personify itself in artificial light. It's actually any kind of light that has been altered from natural sources as well. So it could be sitting behind a window or wearing sunglasses, for example. So the two sides of light: natural, excellent, really good quality light that the full spectrum benefits us from a hormonal standpoint and a circadian rhythm standpoint. But when we start interfering and taking out frequencies of light and creating junk light, then we start negatively impacting the endocrine system in our bodies.
And I think this is interesting because it's analogous to food. Could we think about junk light or light that has had some of the normal full spectrum of wavelengths removed as a type of processed food, or a processed type of light that may not be so evolutionarily consistent with what we're used to as humans and may not be great for us?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a great point, and it's one that myself and a neurosurgeon, Dr. Jack Kruse, actually talks a lot about. The light that your food is evolving under is very key to ultimately your health as well. When you think about it from a nutrient density standpoint, when you look at your, let's talk about a chicken, for instance. If you talk about a free-range chicken that's living outside, eating from, the ground that is exposed to natural sunlight, comparing that to a chicken that's growing up indoors in a barn under artificial light, the nutrient density of the free-range chicken is going to be much better, much more superior than the sort of lab-grown under artificial light chicken, in essence. And when you're looking at pound for pound, what you want is the highest nutrient density, what I guess we evolved to eat. You want to be eating the chicken that's been grown outside. If you're eating plants, you want to be eating the plants that have been grown outside and not indoors under artificial lighting conditions. When you start removing specific spectrums and colors of lighting, it has an adverse effect whether you're an animal or a plant, because those species, whether they be plants or animals, have evolved under natural light for millions and millions of years, only for us in the last sort of 50, 60 years to start changing the light frequencies, which is having a bearing on how that plant or that animal actually operates internally. So
junk light is processed food.
Exactly that. It really is. It's the new smoking, as they say. Sitting's the new smoking. Junk light's the new smoking. But yeah, no, it is pretty much processed food, and you don't want to be. You don't have to be a rocket scientist or a listener of this amazing podcast to understand that anything that's been artificially tampered with is not going to be very favourable to your health. And a lot of people draw the line at food. They just think, right, what we eat and drink is ultimately all that's going to govern our health, and then they neglect the less obvious side of things, which is the non-native EMFs that are in our environment, which includes and extends to artificial junk light as well.
It's certainly something that I hadn't thought as much about until the last few months, and certainly being in Africa with the Hadza in February made me think about this. They are, the light in here just went off. Hold on one sec. Let me see if I can turn it back on. I don't know if that's going to happen again. We'll see. Anyway, there's monkeys throwing nuts on the ceiling, and there's lights going up. Anyway, maybe that's just too much junk light.
That's exactly
lights, because
it's a sign.
it should just be going off. I'm going to do the rest of the podcast in the dark. But when I was in Tanzania, I thought about this because the Hadza are always outside.
Yeah.
Obviously, 24 hours a day they're outside. They never have artificial light. They're never indoors. They're never in blue light. They're never staring at a computer. And obviously, I'm staring at a computer right now as I'm doing this podcast. So accept that as a condition. But there's none of these junk wavelengths that they're getting exposed to on their skin and their eyes, their suprachiasmatic nucleus, none of this. And so one of the cool things about being in Costa Rica, or that drew me to spend more of my time at this latitude, was that the environment here is such that I can be outside almost all day. And I very rarely need to use any artificial light. In the evening, I can put light bulbs in my house in Costa Rica that are red, and I can avoid as much blue light in the evening as I desire to. And during the day, I can be outside so much because it's so nice and warm out here that I'm in the sun so much more, and I'm in the sun surfing, and so obviously that's why I have so much melanin in my skin. But I think that this is a concept that is difficult to overstate, and we see over and over and over again as we study humans. What we have been experiencing as Homo sapiens, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, even our Neanderthal ancestors, or Homo heidelbergensis, our history, our evolutionary path over the last 2 to 4 to 6 million years has really shaped who we are today, whether we're talking about how we were exposed to light, how we were eating. And it's striking to me, and I just want to emphasize this fact, that whenever we deviate from that, we run into problems as humans. As much as we in 2021 desire to become cybernetic organisms, to become fused with computers, to become a different species, to evolve into something different, I believe that we are still rooted in this ancestral evolutionary biology, and we need to be very careful about how quickly we move away from that. And so that's really been the line of thinking, the paradigm, the sort of the framework that has guided a lot of my nutritional thinking, and it extends to light. And I think this is a great example that it's difficult to really appreciate this until we understand that our ancestors were outside all the time. And so many of us are just literally swimming in blue light all the time. And I just want people to understand that these wavelengths are not, they're not really whole, quote, food, right? This is processed light. So let's, just so that all the listeners understand this, walk us through light. What is light? I remember learning about this in physics. It's a particle and a wave. Yeah. What are wavelengths? And give us a framework for how to think about this incredible thing that we're always bathed in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk a little bit about what light is, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we as humans evolved under it and how it shaped us today, and then how blue light obviously then negatively impacts us, from a circadian standpoint. But, light is made up of all different colors, okay? So I guess the easiest way to put it is when it rains and the sun's out, you get something called a rainbow that appears in the sky. And everyone knows the song, and you can see all the different colors in there. You've got your greens, your blues, your reds, your ambers, your indigo, your violets. And that is ultimately all the different colors that make up ultimately white light that you see. You can't really see light in its native form, but you shine the light through a prism, or you see a rainbow, and you'll see all the colors that make up that complete spectrum of light. Now, light actually gets a little bit more complicated than that. There's actually both visible light and invisible light. So your visible light is what you're seeing through the spectrum of the rainbow or through the prism, and the invisible light is your near infrareds or your gamma rays or your your ultraviolet lights, those types of things. So you can't see them, but they're still there in the environment. You can never really see them, but your body can perceive that they're there actually via other colours of light, but I can come and talk about that a bit later on. Now, the way we measure light is in nanometers, okay? So when you hear someone say, oh, a study says, right, 410 nanometer light, to the light expert, you know that that's blue light. So there runs in boundaries. So blue light runs from 400 to 480 nanometers. So any sort of wavelength that falls in that banding would be the color blue. Green then runs from 481 up to 570 nanometers. So anything that falls in that is green light. And it goes on then to yellow, and then anything post 600 is your sort of deep reds, and then you can get even higher in the spectrum and get up to around about 800 nanometers to 1,000 nanometers, and then you're getting into the realms of the infrared, the type of light that you see emitted from the sun at sunset, or your red light therapy device that you're using, those types of healing invisible frequencies of light. Now, hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, whatever your belief is in terms of how humans evolved, we evolved, as you rightly said, Paul, outside. And we developed something that all the animals and all the plants actually developed as well, which was something called a circadian rhythm. Okay, so it comes from a Latin word circa, and dian, which means about a day. And it's basically a rhythm that originates in the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, and it's a clock in essence that tells the time to the body based on external environmental stimulus. These can be temperature, these can be sort of electromagnetic, these can be light, anything really like that. But the biggest governor and driver of the creation of our circadian rhythms, along with the rest of the animals and plants all these hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, was light. So what happened was that we developed clock proteins within this system that were triggered by specific frequencies of light. So when the sun rose in the morning, we would have this trigger and entrainment of our circadian rhythms that would release cortisol very high and in very high quantities in the morning, which was almost like that defibrillator on the body saying, right, jumpstart you into the day. You've got to be active now. You've got to go out and hunt. You've got to go out and gather, do whatever you want to do during the day to stay alive. As the sun sort of goes throughout the day, it actually changes in its spectral density and frequencies. And every time it changes, it's constantly sending messages through our eyes to this clock system, the circadian rhythm, to say, right, it's this time of the day, you need to suppress this hormone, release this neurotransmitter, and it allows us to function correctly. When the sun then started to set in the evening, that would then send a cue to the central clock system to say, right, we need to now start reducing our cortisol levels. We need to now get ready to increase something called melatonin, which helps in the recovery of any inflammation during the day, any cellular damage, helps us sleep. And then the campfire goes on, for instance, you get a bit of light from the ground up, and then you go to sleep. And then the next morning, the sun rises, the cortisol spikes, and you go through that same process. And when you start sort of reading some of the studies that are out there, you find that one of the biggest triggers in training the circadian rhythm from an ancestral standpoint was the frequencies of light that fall in the 400 to 480 nanometer range, that blue light. And you can kind of see that from an observational standpoint when you look up at the sky outside. What color is the sky during the day when the sun's shining? It's blue. So what the studies have looked at is, that sort of blue release of light is actually what's causing that circadian rhythm to be active during the day and basically make us daily, binaural active during the day. And what happened in the sort of 90s when we introduced LED lighting into our lives, we started to put it in backlit LED devices. Our smartphones, they started to come to fruition. TVs became, much more clearer and brighter, higher in blue light. Our house lights were all, LEDs which contain blue light. And what this is doing is it's sending a message to the clock system in our brain, because it's governed by light, to say it's daytime when actually it's maybe 9 o'clock at night and you're watching your favourite Netflix show. You may be opening your fridge door to make your dinner at 7 o'clock in the evening when it's dark outside, and the light in the fridge is emitting blue light, which is then sending another message to your brain saying, we don't need any melatonin right now, we need cortisol because it's daytime. The brain can't distinguish between artificial and natural light. So when we're shining artificial light sources into our eyes after sunset, we're ultimately saying to our circadian rhythm, it's daytime, so we're going to struggle to get to sleep. If we can still get to sleep, it might not be the best quality of sleep, so we're not going to get the correct apoptosis and autophagy. We're going to scramble our circadian rhythm, so we might get to sleep, but then we might wake up at 3 in the morning. We might not want to get up. We might feel really tired in the morning. So what we've done is we've moved away from natural sunlight, which we've evolved under and created our circadian rhythm and our hormonal endocrine system under, switched it to this artificial sunlight that we've created in the form of LEDs, and now our bodies are just like, what the heck is going on? Like, I don't know whether to release cortisol, to suppress it, to release melatonin. Insulin levels are going haywire as well, and blood sugar levels, which has been shown again in studies to be a result of having blue light at the incorrect times of the day. So, it's very concerning when there's not a lot of talk about this, because you could be doing everything correctly from a dietary standpoint and an exercise standpoint, but if you're disregarding light, you're not going to reach that whole optimal sort of human organism end goal that your followers and community and yourself are looking for, because there's so many different components to the health piece, and light being one of those that's often neglected.
It's hugely important, and like I said in the beginning of the podcast, being in Costa Rica makes me feel like I am very lucky to have access to lots of ultraviolet light. One of the things that I talk about a lot with my social media and my presence online is the importance of getting ultraviolet light, getting full spectrum ultraviolet light on the skin. We've talked about that millions of times now with regard to COVID and other disease outcomes. And so it's amazing to be here in Costa Rica with lots of ultraviolet light and subsequently lots of melanin. And I think that, like I said, getting that much ultraviolet light, being outside, there are so many beautiful sunsets here that it reminds me to watch them. And then I think, oh, okay, yeah, it just makes me realize that I shouldn't be getting a ton of blue light at night. And it's nice that I can avoid that. But it's a challenging thing for us today in our society. Like you said, even opening the freaking refrigerator. So at my house in Austin, I have red lights throughout the house. And after it gets dark, I put red light bulbs into, I have red light bulbs that are sort of interchangeable. And I have lights that are regular lights for the daytime if I need that. And then I have red lights. And so at night, if you come over to my house in Austin, I've had people joke that it feels like they're in a lizard cage because it's just a bunch of red light. And yeah, that's absolutely right. And some people can't handle it, but most people really appreciate how calming that red light is. But one of the questions that I'm curious for your perspective on is how much blue light is disruptive? If I'm walking around my house in Austin or here in Costa Rica and it's after dark, maybe I wore blue blocking glasses during the intervening hours, if I was using my computer or I used a program like Flux, or my favorite is Iris on the computer to remove the blue wavelengths going into my eyes. And I go to the refrigerator and I'm looking at the refrigerator door with a bunch of apprehension, thinking, I don't want to open the refrigerator because I don't want to mess up my circadian rhythms. Like, any sense of how much is really going to affect us? Can I open the refrigerator and grab a coconut or a mineral water, or how do I do that?
Yeah, no, really, really good question, and one that comes up quite a lot. And you can open the refrigerator. Just make sure you've got some good quality blue light blocking glasses on, or change your fridge light to a little red one. That's a good hack as well. But it's difficult to find the red bulb for that. But yeah, from a I guess a theoretical standpoint, there's a very interesting individual in Germany that's been studying light for the last 20 years, and someone that you should probably try and get onto your podcast as well. he's a little bit dry and direct. So it's probably the German in him a little bit there, but he's a very knowledgeable guy, Dr. Alexander Wunsch. And he is just like the godfather of light. This guy's doing all the studies. He's looking at mercury resonance theory at the moment, which is about how specific fluorescent lighting can actually activate mercury within the body and cause it to become toxic, because there's a specific frequency of light which triggers the mobility and activation of mercury in the body. So this guy's like, he blows your mind with his theories and tests. But he's actually looked at this from a melatonin suppression standpoint. So I was of the belief a few years ago that even if you just literally saw a small bit of blue light after sunset, that was it. Your circadian rhythm was done. But actually, it's not as serious as that. It causes something called phase shifting. If you continually expose yourself to blue light, then put your blue light glasses on, or go into a room with red light, which can mean that your bedtime will gradually get later, or you will struggle to fall asleep for a few minutes a day, and then over time you can then really disrupt your circadian rhythm, but it's not going to be instant. But in terms of a melatonin suppression standpoint, what Wunsch has shown is that it happens for about 20 minutes. So if you're wearing blue light glasses, you take them off and expose yourself to artificial blue light from the fridge, say, or from your TV or your house lights. You're going to put back the production of your melatonin curve for that evening back by about 20 minutes. But within 20 minutes time, you'll be fully secreting and producing the optimal amounts of melatonin again if you remove the source of blue light. So in answer to your question, if it's just a quick sort of grab my coconut and steak out the fridge, you're probably going to be okay. But if you're repeatedly doing that, the phase shifting over time, 6 months, a year, 2 years time, you could end up with some sort of circadian rhythm disruption if you're repeatedly doing it.
And so I think that the take-home message for people is, unless you are a sleep god or goddess, meaning that you fall asleep easily, you don't wake up in the night, you wake up, you do freaking backflips, and you feel super refreshed, we should be thinking about light, junk light, blue light exposure. I mean, I have to think about this. Like, I've gone through phases in my life where I wake up in the middle of the night and my mind is racing, and whether that's stress or something else that I'm working on, or I drank too many coconuts and I have to go pee, or whatever, it's interesting to think that protecting myself, which often means stepping outside of the norm a little bit, doing things that are counterculture, actually taking initiative and creating an environment in my home that is conducive to this type of ancestral type lifestyle. This is what I have to do in order to live the best life that I choose to live. And it sounds extreme to people, but I think that it's all just what it's worth to you. Eating an animal-based diet sounds extreme to people. It's just what it's worth to you. And to me, it's very, very worth it, because being able to perform well during the day is everything to me. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on food as well, because here I am talking about going into the refrigerator after dark and getting some sort of food out. And for a long time, I've eaten 2 meals a day, and generally eaten a late breakfast and then a late lunch during a 6 to 8 hour window. But sometimes I do eat later at night if I go to restaurants with friends. And so what are your thoughts on that? What do we know about when to eat?
Yeah, and it's another great question, because so many people focus on what to eat, not when to eat. And you start to see, like 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you've got people like Dr. Bill Lagakos talking a lot about circadian rhythms and meal timing. And he was one of the first people that I started engaging with when I got into light sort of 5-6 years ago on Twitter. And he talks a lot about the circadian theory of eating, and if you're into your bodybuilding, Menno Henry a lot about circadian rhythms when it comes to training times, for instance. But when you actually take a look at eating from a circadian standpoint, there actually becomes quite a clear picture that there are specific times of the day that would be more favorable to eat. And, we're not talking about, getting the cutting edge, getting the extra 1% here. We're actually talking about sort of major circadian disruption if you're doing it incorrectly. And the way the modern world is set up from a social standpoint is that we typically eat our largest meal in the evenings. It's a time for family to gather. It's a time to eat a big meal together and then relax in an evening. But when you actually start looking at the evidence and some of the theories that are out there, it's actually counterintuitive to eat a very large meal after dark, because digestion actually gets in the way of melatonin production. Now, when you look at how melatonin is produced, a lot of people go, produced in the pineal gland, and it's secreted after dark in the absence of blue light. And that's only part of the truth. It actually all starts from the gut, the production of melatonin, and you need two fundamental neurotransmitters, hormones, to actually trigger the creation of melatonin, and that's serotonin and tryptophan. You need those two in abundance in order to optimize the production of melatonin, and this actually starts in the gut. And when we're actually starting to digest food in an evening, we're actually then getting in the way of that process of the production of melatonin, so you're not going to produce as much of it, and the digestion is going to disrupt your sleep as a consequence. And when you look at how the circadian system is set up in the GI tract as well, you actually find that leptin levels, ghrelin levels, and neuropeptides are at their most favorable to digest food in the mornings. So when you are thinking about setting up an eating protocol, you want to consume the majority of your calories at the front part of the day, and then slowly taper those off during the day, or confine it to 1 or 2 meals, which I know a lot of people are doing, but more at the beginning of the day rather than at the end of the day. So you're not interfering with digestion and production of melatonin, which stems from the gut, as we've spoken about, but also utilizing your ancient circadian rhythm and the hormonal processes in your body, which are governed by light, in so much that the best time for your body to digest and partition the macronutrients that you're eating in a favorable way is during the beginning of the day. And there's a really interesting old wise adage that I always love, and that's, eat dinner like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And there's always truth in these old wives' tales as well, when you actually look at it later in life with studies and theories, that a lot of what they're saying, they probably didn't know the science behind it, but they knew that if they ate a lot of food before they went to bed, they perhaps didn't feel the best or sleep the best that evening. So it is all about meal timing, and some of the bros in the bodybuilding world have probably got it quite right as well. They look at timing of food in relation to the activity they're doing, like lifting weights or whatever it may be, and taking a slower digesting protein before they go to bed, and avoiding high fatty foods in the evening because they take longer to digest. So there's lots of sort of things that I think people don't know they're doing it, but they know they feel better when they do it a certain way. But eating is one of those things, and there's a big movement, as you'll know, in the world in intermittent fasting, and I don't hear so much about it much these days, but 4 or 5 years ago it was a huge thing. Like eat, get up in the morning, fast all the way through to dinner, and then smash 2,000 calories in the evening. And I think that's great from a calorie restriction point of view, and probably great from an autophagy point of view, and allowing your cells to repair and everything. But from a circadian rhythm standpoint, those people have probably got it the wrong way around. You probably want to be getting up in the morning, feasting, and then then not eating for the rest of the day, if you want to set yourself up correctly from a circadian standpoint.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just to clarify for people, I think what you meant was dinner, breakfast like a king, yes. Lunch like a prince, yeah. Dinner like a pauper. Just to clarify that, you guys all probably figured that out when you were listening, but I've always wondered about that. I hear from a lot of people that they do intermittent fasting of 16/8. and they will do like a coffee in the morning, and they'll start eating at noon, and they will stop eating at 8 p.m. And I think it would be more optimal to do it earlier in the day. And I did a podcast with Will Cole earlier this year on potential benefits of intermittent fasting. I think it's important to note that you can do too much, that you can do one meal a day and you can affect your hormones negatively. And perhaps in the future, I'll do some conversations about potential downsides of intermittent fasting. I think that every individual is going to have to keep a close eye on how they feel, their recovery, their sleep, their libido, their body composition if you want to restrict your eating windows. I generally find for myself that I feel better when I do about an 8-hour eating window. Sometimes it's 9 or even 10. And it's hard for me to want to eat in over 12 hours in a day, especially if I'm, but then, I get up at about 6 or 5:30 and I may have a little bit of food then. And in that case, maybe occasionally my eating window would be 11 hours. But I don't think people need to be totally militant about this. And I think we just need to accept the fact that if you go too strictly with your eating window, that could affect you negatively. And I've seen that with one meal a day, eating repeatedly in people. If you try all of your calories in 3 or 4 hours, you often won't get enough nutrients, you won't get enough calories, and that can have negative impacts. So extending to 2 or 3 meals a day is not the end of the world. And, I was talking to one of my friends the other day, and he made this great point that if you're fasting so much or you're intermittent fasting to the point that it affects your thyroid function, that's not going to be good for autophagy anyway either. So, but I definitely think that if you have any sort of sleep quality tracking device, you're going to see an improvement if you give yourself at least, I don't know, what would you say, 3-4 hours before you go to sleep when your last meal ends?
Yeah, I would suggest that's probably right. I think as soon as your blue light blocking glasses go on, you don't want to be eating or drinking. I think typically that's 2 to 3 hours before bed. So I think that's probably a good rule of thumb.
So let's talk about this. So here in Costa Rica, I'm close to the equator. The sun rises almost every morning at about 5:20, and it sets almost every day around 5:20 or 5:30. We're pretty close to 12 hours and 12 hours. I don't have a lot of seasonal variation here in terms of when the sun goes down. So my blue light blockers are usually going on around 5:30 or 6 after I watch the sunset, maybe 6:30 at the latest. And then I'm often going to sleep a lot earlier here because I think the sun has set so much earlier all year round. But what about in places where there's more seasonal variation? What about seasonal eating, in relation to a longer day? Someone in another part of the world, this is something I thought about a lot coming here, so I'll piggyback on whatever your thoughts are. But, for a little while when I was in residency at the University of Washington, I lived in Seattle. In the summer, the sun would go down at 9 or 10 p.m. And then in the winter, it would go down at 4 p.m. And certainly there are listeners in Canada or northern latitudes in both the North and the South Hemisphere listening to this podcast. How would that affect things?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And one I did a little YouTube video myself on our channel, just talking a little bit about seasonality of sleep. And, it develops more into seasonality of eating as well, and the types of things you're eating. But yeah, it's a tricky one. It's not a tricky one from an ancestral standpoint, but the problem is modern world has got in the way of things, and now what was socially acceptable back in the Paleolithic is really not socially acceptable today. So there comes a problem, and by that I mean, sleep is seasonal. You only have to look at the hibernation of animals. The longer, when the sun rises, the birds come up. When the sun sets, they go away, regardless of what time that is, whether it's 4 hours of sunlight or whether it's 16 hours of sunlight or whatever it may be. And, by this, I mean that in the sort of winter months in those northern latitudes, when it's darker earlier and the sun comes up a lot later, the period of sleep should actually, in my opinion, be extended. You might be having 10 hours sleep a night. In the summer, the sun might not set, like you said, until 10 p.m. at night, and then might come up at 5-6 in the morning, at which point 7 or 8 hours sleep is going to be enough. We've entrained these circadian rhythms over millennia to be governed by seasonality and light and dark cycles, but then things get complicated in our modern world because I mean, we can't at the moment in Australia because they won't let us anywhere else in the world, but you can travel anywhere you want in the world. So you can ultimately take yourself from Washington down to Costa Rica, and your ancestry might be Scandinavian. You don't know where you evolved in order to understand where the best place for you to live could well be. And when I was speaking to Dr. Jack Cruz on our podcast a few weeks ago, I was saying to him, is Australia the best place for me? And in answer to his question, a Caucasian with blue eyes, probably not the best place for me ancestrally. So when it comes to locating a place for you to live in the world, you kind of need to know your ancestry to, I mean, obviously it's going to be difficult going back, 600, 700,000 years, but, at least understanding where you evolved from. And little cues and clues can come in, like eye color, hair color, skin color, maybe your surname, to locate where you've come from, to find out where that key latitude is for you to live. And for some people, it could be Scandinavia, where UV light is low, so skin color is a lot lower in melanin, so it's a lot paler. It could be on the equatorial areas where the skin tones are darker because of the higher UV content. But in answer to your question as well, and I'm sort of deviating a little bit here, is that circadian rhythms are really interesting in so much that because they're clues in the name, about a day, circadian, in so much that every day your circadian rhythm is reset to wherever you are. So when you fly somewhere, the other side of the world, and you experience something called jet lag, that's your circadian rhythm off. But when you've been in that area for, 3 or 4 days, maybe a week, you start to feel fine. You start to become more cognizant of your surroundings. You start to get up at the correct time. You start to go to sleep at the correct time. That's because your circadian rhythm is re-entraining itself to the local environment. And the same things happen seasonally. You haven't just got this circadian rhythm that, right, I've got to be up at 6, I've got to be in bed by 6. When the light changes from a seasonality point of view or from a travel point of view, your circadian rhythm will then readapt to that environment. And that could mean more sleep, it could mean less sleep, it could mean more energy, it could mean less energy. So it really depends on where you are in the world, how your circadian rhythm then adapts. Because imagine, for instance, that you had a circadian rhythm that was fixed. And it was really interesting because I was in Port Douglas in Cairns a couple of weeks ago, and I jumped on a shared bus to get back to our accommodation. And there was a backpacker there talking about circadian rhythms to someone, and it was fascinating. I didn't say anything, I just listened in because I don't want to get into like, no, this is incorrect and ruin his holiday. But he was going like, oh yeah, circadian rhythms are nonsense. Like, I like literally think about people in the Arctic Circle, all this sunlight, it comes at 24 hours a day and then it doesn't come for ages and they still function correctly and this, that and the other. And it was like, so, and then he went on to say when he was at university, he went to bed at like 2 a.m. and he was fine with that and it wasn't an issue, and wherever he is in the world he'll always go to bed at the same time. And it was just so confusing to me that he seemed to think that your circadian rhythms were just fixed. No matter where you were in the world, you had to go to bed at whatever time it was in the country that you were in sort of originally. He didn't look the healthiest, I'll put it that way. But the good thing is with circadian rhythms is that wherever you are in the world, whatever the season is, whether it's cloudy outside or not so much sunlight, they will adapt on a daily basis. And I think it's just absolutely fascinating that, if you have a bad diet for 20 or 30 years, it's going to take you, 2, 3, 4, 5 years to correct any of that by good eating habits. Whereas with light, you can almost make the change pretty much instantaneously, in so much that if you've had, if you're having bad sleep or you haven't been looking after your circadian rhythm, it's not going to take years to fix that circadian rhythm. It's going to take a couple of days at most. And, when you're talking about it from a seasonality point of view, I think that a circadian rhythm, not just on latitude or travel, will change, but also when you're going through different seasons, it will change and either allow you to be awake for longer or allow you to be asleep for longer without leaving you feeling in a really bad way.
It's really interesting to me. It seems that humans are very adaptable, and there is this push right now toward looking at our genetics and trying to either decode the optimal diet for an individual based on your genetics, or, like you said, decode an ideal location for that person to live based on your genetics. But on the flip side, I also wonder if humans are not just very adaptable. Historically, we moved all over the globe. And I suspect that we probably can live throughout the globe as humans, regardless of our skin tone, regardless of our eye color. I think that these things can tell us where our ancestors came from. But being here in Costa Rica, I've seen some pretty light-skinned individuals, whether they're from Britain or from other places in the world, Norwegians, get really tan.
Yes.
and adapt to being here.
Yeah.
And so I find this very interesting, and I want to talk about sun tanning and sun burning in a moment, but I think I've spoken about that on another podcast that I've done. I'm really fascinated by the adaptability of the human organism to our latitude based on light, both for diet and for light exposure, melanin in the skin, etc. The theory that I am entertaining at this point is that if we're thinking about macronutrient ratios, it makes more sense for humans to eat more carbohydrates when we're closer to the equator and we might have had access to fruit year round. And certainly being in Costa Rica, it's felt more, quote, natural to me to eat fruit that's grown in this area than it does when I'm in Texas at 28 latitude or in Seattle at 37 or 38, or I don't even know what Seattle is. It's very far from the equator. So the idea there with regard to food might be the further we are from the equator, the more fat and the less carbohydrates we should have. It's just an idea. And the closer we are to the equator, the more carbohydrates and maybe a little bit less fat in our diet, because that's how we would have had things available. So that's interesting to think about how light, circadian rhythms, the amount of light in a day might affect macronutrient ratios. But I also wonder, and that's in juxtaposition to any sort of actual genetics, rather than the listener getting all bent out of shape and twisted about like, well, I'm an ancestor from this part of the world, another ancestor from that part of the world, that means I should eat things that grow there or things that grow here. I think we should maybe just be eating what grows near where we're actually living as humans. That makes a lot of sense to me too. And with regard to light, I think we should probably just get adapted to the circadian rhythm and the light cycles of the places that we're in as a human. And I think our bodies will probably adapt. So let's use that as a segue to sunburn and sun tanning, because it's actually kind of distracting for me to look at myself in the video. I'm thinking, I hope it doesn't look as dark as I see it. Maybe the camera quality will be better, because I'm very, very dark. And I'm of Sicilian ancestry, so clearly I have some Mediterranean blood, but some of my other ancestry is German-Irish, which is not necessarily people that get this tan traditionally. Anyway, in the carnivore and animal-based communities, one of the things that I ask people about that gets a huge response every single time is the question, do you sunburn less with dietary change? And resoundingly, these are all anecdotes, the answer is, absolutely I sunburn less. And I hypothesize this has to do with seed oils and changes in the diet. I'm sure there are people listening to this now nodding and saying, yes, I tan more easily, I burn less when I make these changes. But how do you think about sun tanning and sunburning? Does blue light play into this at all? How do we think about this with regard to blue light in conjunction with dietary change, which might also be helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that you sort of spoke earlier about the Scandinavian people that are looking, like they've got a really healthy tan at the moment in Costa Rica. That's we touched upon it earlier, the melanin that's actually developing in their skin, and there's no evidence that when you start at the equator, the skin tone of humans there is obviously very dark, and the further north you go, right up into Scandinavia, the paler their skin tone becomes, and that's all to do with the amount of melanin that's in their skin. And what melanin is, it's almost like a, you know, for want of a better word, like a natural sunscreen in essence. So what happens is melanin is produced in response to the amount of UV light that is present in the environment, and then acts as a filtration sort of system to it, so we're not going to get too much or too little of it. So when, for instance, when you're in Scandinavia and the environment there is very low in UV light, you want to have as little melanin as possible, so paler skin as possible, because you don't want to filter out as much UV light as someone that is perhaps living on the equator, that is exposed to just as much of it. It's in abundance, you know, there's so much of it that you don't need all of it into your body, because there comes a point when UV will cause some sort of cellular damage. So that's why we produce a lot of melanin at the you know, at the tropics, at the equatorial regions. So it's a fundamental you know, biological response to the type of light that is present in a given latitude that you're living in. So the best way to build up melanin to protect yourself against, you know, too much UV light exposure during the day in these regions is to be outside during the periods when UV light are actually lowest, which is in the mornings. So you're saying, you know, go out and have a surf and things like that. I'd imagine that's probably in the mornings. You know, you're outside then for the rest of the day because you're not going to burn, because you've built up melanin by being outside in the lower UV periods. So where people do it wrong and then start to sunburn is that they get up, expose themselves to artificial blue light, they're not outside, and then they go outside during high UV periods from 11 AM onwards, and they've got no protection. You know, you're literally going out with no melanin protection, and you're just going to get too much UV in, you're going to go pink, you're going to burn, and you're going to cause yourself cellular damage. Now, the way, there's a couple of interesting sort of studies and theories that Paul and I were actually just chatting about before coming on here, about the, I guess, how junk light can actually contribute or may be contributing to the development of melanoma. And that is the wearing of sunglasses outside can or might be leading to more incidences of melanoma. But also exposure to blue light after a day in the sun can also lead to you know, the production of melanoma as well. And the way that those two sort of theories, and then more work needs to be done on this, you know, these are just sort of theories out there at the moment, is that when you wear sunglasses when you're outside during high periods of UV, it's telling the brain that it's actually dark outside. And it's really interesting that the body can't detect UV light, okay? There is only one way that the body can detect ultraviolet light, and that is in the presence of blue light. What the body has come to realize is that when blue light is present, UV light should also be present as well. So it increases the hormone cortisol, which is the antagonist to ultraviolet light, which actually helps then protect you against any kind of you know, sunburn or you know, greater cellular damage. So when you're putting on your sunglasses, you're actually filtering out a lot of the blue light, so you're not creating enough cortisol to mitigate any of the negative effects of the ultraviolet light, because like anything in nature, it's a double-edged sword. Great benefits from UV light synthesizing with cholesterol to create vitamin D, but too much of it is going to be detrimental to you in terms of cellular damage. I guess it's a bit like, you know, I feel UV gets a bad rap. I think it's similar to cholesterol as well. You know, like it's almost like cholesterol's getting blamed for what the inflammation is doing, and it's almost like UV light is getting blamed for what blue light is potentially doing. And in this other study that they looked at in the lab was that they looked at skin cells that were exposed to 410 nanometer blue light, and what they found was that the skin has its own circadian rhythm, whereby during the day the blue light actually allows it to become protective and in that active phase. But when the blue light is removed and you go into that dark phase, so after sunset, the skin goes into its repair mode. And when we look at that from a theoretical standpoint, if you're getting damage from UV light during the day, which we are going to, it's an inevitability of ultraviolet light, will get some damage. The body's response is that when darkness ensues and blue light disappears, the skin should then be able to start repairing itself. But what we're doing is we're coming home after a day on the beach or whatever it may be, bathing in artificial blue light, and the skin hasn't got a chance to repair itself. So, we do this over periods of time, then these cells that are continually being damaged are going to mutate and potentially become cancerous. So I think it's always unfair the mechanism to repair damage is darkness, but we're now that is illuminated 24/7, and we're not giving our skin an us to heal.
It was so interesting to kind of talk about that a little bit before the podcast. And a lot of people listening to this will just be, I think, surprised by this, but sunglasses are probably not a great thing for humans. They're certainly something that our ancestors would never have used.
Yeah.
And getting light into your eyes is not a bad thing. And I think that there's got to be a multi-billion dollar industry in these sunglasses that are not evolutionarily consistent with anything we would have done as humans. And it's just such a fascinating connection that we are talking about, and the hypothesis exists that perhaps by blocking blue light during the day, we are causing problems for our skin because our body doesn't realize that ultraviolet light is arriving on the body. Now, certainly our skin can sense ultraviolet light, but at a brain level, at a hormonal level in the suprachiasmatic nucleus or in other areas of the brain, that where this hormonal circadian entrainment occurs, could we be creating problems or potentially worsening our risk of these cancers by wearing sunglasses? That is a really interesting concept. And the answer is simple, like just don't do these things that are evolutionarily, ancestrally inconsistent, guys. Like, you probably don't want to wear sunglasses. Now, if you're out there on a bright day, I think if you just let your eyes adjust, they'll usually be just fine. Maybe wear a hat or something that shades your eyes, but don't necessarily cover them completely. But I didn't know that the eyes didn't really have a sense or an inability to sense ultraviolet. That if they don't see UV, or if they don't see blue, that they assume there's no ultraviolet there, and vice versa, that if they do see blue light, they assume ultraviolet is around. And I think the same could be said if we're in blue light, that your body could increase cortisol at a time when you don't want it to increase cortisol. And again, we could be disrupting things or creating problems with hormonal cycling. And then the study that I showed was the one that you had sent to me prior to the podcast, and I thought it's just very interesting. And what it shows is that when they take these epithelial cells and they expose them to blue light, they see changes in this PER1 gene, which is a clock gene. And again, they're using blue light at 410 nanometers. And if you look at the conclusions of the study, they said that these epithelial keratinocytes were very sensitive to blue light exposure, which impacted their core clock system. So this actually begins to ask the question, should we make blue light blocking things for our skin, which is really just clothes, right? Like here I am opening the refrigerator door, blocking my eyes, which is important for the hormones, but I might also want to be blocking my skin. I know Jack Cruz has talked about this. I've talked about this with my other friends. Like, is it enough to be blocking just our eyes at night? Should we also be blocking our skin, which speaks to the idea of just putting red light bulbs in your home and really not exposing any of your epidermis to blue light after dark. And if people are listening to this and kind of shaking their heads and saying, this is undoable, Paul, it's too much, then just do what you're comfortable with, but understand that evolutionarily, our skin would not have been exposed to much blue light after dark, in our history as humans. The firelight, as we've said, is very warm. There's not a lot of blue light in fire. It's very small. It's mostly red and other wavelengths. But it's very interesting to think about the way that this one specific wavelength, or this section of wavelengths, 400 to 480, specifically this 410 nanometers they use in this study, is so impactful for humans. And we need to be very careful about how we dose that, and dose that in a consistent manner with what our biology is expecting. And so the idea that blue light could be contributing to skin cancers is fascinating and compelling, and something to be considered by impairing our body's natural turnover and repair mechanisms in our skin. And the fact that sunglasses could be contributing that was very interesting when we talked about that. So if somebody were going to kind of biohack this, for lack of a better term, or deconstruct it and then reconstruct it, I mean, short of people actually living outdoors and going back to cooking with fires or using fires at night, like, what is your sense of how people can do this? We've mentioned a lot of them, but let's just think, if people are thinking about, like, okay, how do I construct an environment that's more evolutionarily consistent, more ancestrally consistent? What do you think we should be doing?
Yeah, good question. And it's actually quite straightforward. It's just generating some habits that relate to light, and that there's only a few of us, lucky enough to be able to live outside all the time, and a lot of us will have to work indoors. But there are ways to hack that, and the biggest thing you can do for your circadian rhythms is watch every sunrise. Okay, whether it's rain or shine, the first light your eyes need to see in the morning should be the light from the sun. And if you get up in the middle of the winter before the sun rises, then you need to be using red light bulbs or wearing red lens blue light blocking glasses until that sun rises. Basically think to yourself, what would my ancestors have seen if they had got up at this time in the morning? And it wouldn't be their phone, and it wouldn't be artificial LED lights from switching on your bedroom light. So get outside, and that can be a couple of minutes to a couple of hours, whatever you can do, but just make sure that first light that passes through your eyes is natural light from the sun, not your bedroom lights, and you'll be off to a good start. And what I also say to people is that if you're working indoors during the day, you need to be taking breaks outside to allow the different frequencies of light from the sun at different points of the day to send messages to your circadian rhythms. And what I always suggest is that your lunch you shouldn't just go from your desk to the canteen. That's from one artificial source of light to another, and eat your lunch. Take it outside. Go and eat it in a park if it's dry. If it's raining, find somewhere under cover just to be outside in that natural light, and you'll find that your hormones will be regulated a lot better that way. People that have the disgusting habit of smoking are allowed to go out, once in the morning, once in the afternoon in Australia to have a smoke outside. I'm not saying take up smoking to get outside, but just say, I want a sunbreak. These people can go outside and smoke. So I'm having 10 minutes, I'm walking around the block, and exposure, no sunglasses on, expose yourself to the light during that time of the day, and you're just going to feel refreshed and energized, and you're going to get the correct messages to your circadian rhythm. If you can watch the sunset, do it. I think it's a great precursor to melatonin release later on in the evening. That's well worth doing. And during the day as well, you can biohack your workstation a little bit as well. So you mentioned Iris earlier. I like Iris better than Flux for the simple reason that Iris reduces something called flicker rate in your monitors. And the flicker rate of light can actually cause neurological issues, and it actually does in me. If I don't have Iris on my computer, I will develop migraines because the flickering intense pulsation of light that you can't see but your brain can detect causes me to have migraines. So I have to have software such as Iris that reduces that flicker as well and doesn't cause me to have migraine headaches. Also, balancing the spectrum around your workstation is probably beneficial as well. I have red light bulbs. Some people use salt lamps, so you haven't just got one frequency of light coming out at you, you've got other frequencies around you. If you're sitting in an office, try and sit away from a window. You don't want to be sitting close to a window. People think, oh, but a window would be good because natural light's coming through, but glass actually changes the composition of light that's coming through, which can actually be quite detrimental. And I think that when you look at the composition that comes through a window, it's actually a lot of the damaging UVA that comes through, and it actually blocks out some of the more beneficial UV frequencies and infrared, for instance. So that's still junk light. So sit away from a window where you can as well, and just get outside is more beneficial. And then in the evening, the big thing, actually one thing I would mention, for females in particular, there seems to have been a rapid rise in hyperthyroid and Hashimotos related issues. And there was one small study, and I will caveat this, it was a small study in Japan that looked at how blue light impacted the thyroid as well. Because it's so close to the skin, blue light could actually penetrate it and cause some abnormalities to its function. A lot more work needs to be done on that, but what I do say to females is if you can cover that area with a scarf while you're working at your computer, that would be probably, it's better to do it with the theory rather than to allow too much blue light, because when you've got your phone, how are you on your phone? You're literally just shining blue light into your thyroid, and when you're at a computer, that's hitting your thyroid as well. So I always like to say to women in particular, make sure that's covered. And then in the evening, the two big factors there are really, you've got to create an environment that is very ancestral. So they would have been sat around a campfire. So I'm not saying go out into your back garden and sit around the campfire. Like, you can if you want to, but I know a lot of us won't have time or the materials to be able to do that. But just biohack that environment. So get red light bulbs in your lamps. Again, Alexander Wunsch has mentioned that the angle of light during the day and the evening can actually impact us from a hormonal level as well, in so much that red light always should come up from the ground. So have it in lamps at that sort of eye level, and never from above, because red light during the evenings when it was dark never came from above, and your light during the day, if you're going to use a lower blue light light bulb, have them coming from above and not from the ground up. So that seems to have a bearing on some of his work that he's been doing in Germany, so that's well worth considering. And also, you want to be protecting your skin, as you mentioned. Wear long clothing if you can. If you can't and it's sweltering heat, then make sure you've got red light bulbs in there as well, so you're not going to affect and stimulate something called melanopsin, which is present in the skin, which is a blue light photoreceptor, because that can disrupt circadian rhythms and also disrupt the skin's clock system as well. And wearing a good quality pair of blue light blocking glasses is always worth doing as well. Ones that block between 400 and 550 nanometers. That's where the melatonin disruption zone is. And I can send the study for that as well, which shows that is the exact zone of light we need to be blocking to increase melatonin. And just really, it would be remiss of me not to say it, and it's not light related, but make sure you're engaging your parasympathetic nervous system a couple of hours before bed. Don't sit there and watch the news or the Real Housewives 2 hours before bed, otherwise you're going to very stressful state before going to sleep, which isn't good because cortisol increases, melatonin decreases. So try reading under red light, try meditating, maybe, even just sort of binaural beats is great as well, like getting specific wavelengths and frequencies of noise into your brain that resonates with delta wave production. And you'll find you'll just have an amazing sleep, and then you wake up the next day and watch that sunrise and do exactly the same again the next day. So, these things are all really easy, cheap, efficient, free hacks that you can do to really, hack your modern environment. Because the modern environment is amazing. I would not want to be one of these extreme biohackers where I go and live in the middle of a field somewhere. I like technology. We can speak to each other right now, Paul, using technology. It's great, but we just need to be cognizant of the fact that it will cause damage to us if it's not used and managed correctly and hacked accordingly.
Yeah, one of my good friends here in Costa Rica, I was talking to him about technology. He's particularly kind of plugged into the just where technologies come from, and he made this amazing point that humans will always use technology. Technology is not the problem. The problem is understanding when we're overusing technology. And if you look at the Hadza, you could call their bows and arrows technology. Using rocks to break and open a coconut is technology. So it's not that technology is evil. It's just that as humans, we need to be careful that we don't overuse technology, that we don't become overly separated from other individuals due to our digital world, that we don't overuse technology and light bulbs, that we don't use these dirty junk food light bulbs. And so technology is not bad, but we need to guard against overuse of technology, which I found fascinating because I was sort of having this cognitive dissonance. Like, I don't like technology, but then again, I like to be able to do things online. I have a computer. There are some technologies that I like. Electricity is great sometimes. I have a fan in my room, that circulates air. That's a fantastic thing. And yet at the same time, I do think that technology can be damaging for humans, as we know. So there's a fine line there, and we need to be careful of that. Now, there's actually, I appreciate that you mentioned Hashimoto's thyroiditis, because I thought this was particularly interesting that the blue light could affect the thyroid gland negatively. Isn't there some research on red light potentially improving that, or some sort of therapy, some sort of light therapy improving Hashimoto's thyroiditis?
Yeah, and red light's fascinating because we talk about artificial light being bad, but when you harness specific frequencies of red and infrared light, they can actually be hugely beneficial to us. The way, I think there's been over 4,000 peer-reviewed studies on red and infrared light, and I think 200 of them have been the gold standard, double-blind, placebo, really high-quality studies, and even more so than blue light. I think that the research in blue light needs to be extended quite dramatically. It's harder to find the studies, whereas with red light, there's huge amounts of studies on this. And given the position of, as we mentioned, the thyroid gland, which is only a few millimeters below the skin surface in that sort of neck area, it becomes a very good target area for red light. So visible red light around about 660 nanometers is where the studies are talking about the beneficial impacts of red light. And I guess the way it works, and it's hard to explain simply, is that red light actually gets into and helps to catalyze ATP production, so providing more energy within a given area. So it enters, you have your electron chain transport mechanism, which ultimately utilizes something called cytochrome C oxidase at the fourth phase, and then produces ATP, adenosine triphosphate, as an output. But where nitric oxide comes in is it actually takes away from the oxygen which is utilized to produce, to react with cytochrome C oxidase and produce the ATP, making the process very inefficient. But where red light and near infrared light at 660 and 850 nanometers comes in is it actually frees up the oxygen by reacting with the nitric oxide in order to make the system, the ATP production, more efficient and more reliable, which then allows the processes to happen at that cellular level, which includes that sort of healing property that we see utilizing red light therapy devices in the thyroid, in the muscles, clearing things like acne, curing, I've got to be careful what I say there, not curing, potentially treating arthritis, and a whole host of other issues that we have from the modern world. And I find myself, my wife actually uses red light therapy device every night on her face, and she's adamant that it's reducing fine lines, wrinkles, it boosts collagen, she feels fuller, and I utilize it typically after a heavy training session. I have a full panel, I get in front of that, and I find that when I have a big session in the gym, say a big chest session, the delayed onset muscle soreness after a training session where I don't use red light therapy is usually a couple of days, whereas when I use red light therapy from an anecdotal point of view, I'm finding that the next day I've literally got no muscle soreness. It's crazy how that works, and I think it really is an amazing tool to use, red light therapy. I think if people can utilize red light therapy, they should. And it's really that sort of, we've always got to put context into things. People say, blue light's bad. Well, no, it isn't. It's context. It depends when you're getting it and what source. And, the same's true for artificial light, saying all artificial light is bad. Actually, there's 4,000 studies that says that a very specific 2 frequencies of infrared and red light is actually extremely beneficial for us at a cellular level.
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. And I think it's also important to point out that there's red light and infrared light when you go outside. And so that if you're outside in the sunlight, like you said, at the sunset and the sunrise, there's a lot more infrared light there. And I've always wondered whether that's just in proportion to the other wavelengths of light, or there's actually an absolute larger amount of infrared light at sunrise and sunset. I'll ask you that question in a moment, but I just want to point out to people that you can get red light naturally in the environment from the sun and by being outside. And I think that one of the benefits of red light therapy devices is that a lot of us just don't have access to enough sunlight, and it can kind of help to be a supplement. And I love that you pointed out that even though I characterized blue light specifically as junk light earlier in the podcast because it's separated from other wavelengths, and we're sort of then turning around and singing the praises of red light and infrared light wavelength in isolation, they're both useful in the right context, and it's important to understand that they both have powerful effects. And I think that more often than not, we're getting overexposed to blue and underexposed to red, and ultimately it's just about getting outdoors more. But if we can't do that, sometimes these devices can be helpful. Now, and then I think I'll just ask you that question about infrared light, and then we'll wrap up. At sunrise and sunset, what do you think about this? Do you know the answer to this question? Is there an absolute greater amount of infrared light, or is it just that infrared is a larger proportion of the light because there are different wavelengths? Yeah,
I think it needs to be answered in 2. The first is that the composition of the amount of, like infrared light runs across a spectrum of nanometers as well, and that changes throughout the day. So the type of infrared light present at sunrise and sunset is different to the type of infrared that will be found emitted from the sun around about solar noon, for instance. But in terms of the overall amount, my thoughts are the same as yours, in so much that the other colors and the other invisible spectrums like UV are actually a lot lower at that time as well. So it's that sort of balance out that, it might appear that there's more, but there's actually less of the others in there as well. And what you've got to remember is that, I guess infrared is what gives the sun its heat. So is it ultimately warmer at sunrise or sunset than it is midday or 3 p.m. in the afternoon. No, it isn't. So, infrared is present all day in vast quantities. But when you get to sunrise and sunset, the composition of visible light, as well as the invisible UV side of things, is very, very rest of the day. What you find from, say, 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. On just a sort of a general summer's day is very similar throughout that range, whereas the small area of sunset and sunrise, the composition is very different to that big banding in the middle. But in answer to your question, I believe personally that the infrared doesn't change in terms of the volume of it, but the composition of it certainly does change. And I've seen a graphic that Jack Kruse has posted out about this as well, and I'll see if I can dig that out after this conversation and send it to you. It was just something he knocked up to show that it kind of is the same, but it isn't, if that makes sense. So it's really down to the composition, not the amount of it that changes.
And that makes sense, that even within the infrared spectrum there are different wavelengths, and that the wavelengths of infrared light might be different in the morning and the evening, and uniquely beneficial. It's just like eating organs. It's just like eating nose to tail. It's just like eating meat plus organs. Evolutionarily, we would have had all of these light nutrients all the time. And so I think it's important, just like I am a huge advocate for eating organs, I'm becoming more and more hip to the idea that we need to get all of these nutrients in light. We need to get all of these different types of light throughout the day, and they're all important, and we should get as much of them as we can. Now, the last question I have is about contact lenses, because I wear contact lenses, and that the eyes, or at least cannot sense ultraviolet, only blue, because I worry that the contact lenses blocked ultraviolet light, and I didn't want to do that. Now, what are your thoughts about contact lenses? Because I'm considering getting LASIK surgery just so I don't have the contact lens. To be honest, here in Costa Rica, I try and take them out as much as possible. Obviously, I can't surf with glasses, and I've not, nor would I want to surf with glasses or a corrective scuba mask while I'm out surfing. But I would rather, I like glasses because I can take them off easily and get the light directly into my eyes. And so, what are your thoughts about contact lenses?
Yeah, and it's exactly what you said. It's the UV blocking of them, and also the fact that you're putting a screen in front of your eyes. So you're ultimately, when you're outside, you're going to be exposing your eyes to junk light because it's not sunlight that is directly filtering into your eyes. So a lot of people actually message us, message myself about LASIK, and it's probably the best thing you can do, rather than putting contacts in. You don't want to be filtering light from the sun going into your eyes in any way possible. You want it all in its natural form, and if that, again, we're talking about technology. The fact that you can have something like LASIK is absolutely amazing in today's world, because you can bring yourself back to how your eyes should be. I'm not sure how your eyes got damaged, and I don't think anyone would know how their eyes got damaged, but you could theorize that maybe screen usage was contributing to that. We don't know, but it could have been. And the fact that you can reset your eyes to what they should be is going to be really positively impactful on your health from a light perspective. And from an anecdotal point of view, we got a group on Facebook called Light and Health, and there's only about 6,000 people in there, but it's great because we all share our anecdotes of what we've done to try and improve our light hygiene and how that's impacted us. And we've had many posts in there of people that have had LASIK and have reported that they feel better than ever, they're sleeping better, they're feeling better. One thing they do say though is that they're very sensitive to artificial blue light for a while. They find lights in their house are just like blinding for a bit. So a lot of them have obviously adopted protocols of blue light blocking glasses to counteract that. But yeah, I think that Jack Kruse theorizes that UV light is very essential to pass through the eyes from a DC electric current creation standpoint, in so much that he theorizes that UV light actually reacts with DHA in the eye. The highest concentration of DHA in the human body is in the eye, and that chemical reaction actually produces more DC electric current within our cells, which actually help charge and power mitochondria. Again, I haven't seen studies on this, but just a theory from him. So, and he's typically been right about a lot of things in the last sort of 10 years. So, yeah. Long answer short, LASIK over contact lenses every single time, and you'll start to get, full spectrum light back into your eyes, rather than, filtering it through an artificial lens. Yeah,
I think I'm gonna have to go that direction. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, man. Where can people find more of your work?
Yeah, I mean, Facebook is probably the best. Light and Health Group. It's the biggest biohacking sort of community on Facebook, as far as I'm aware. So come and join there. Just type in Light and Health, you'll see it. Someone watching the sunrise, believe it or not. And you can always drop me a message personally on Instagram. I am Andy Mant. There's typically a lot of posts on there on light and business and entrepreneurship as well. Depending on what floats your boat. And I write a blog once a week, which can be found on the blog section of the BLUBlox website, BLUBlox.com. And I also do videos once a week, which range between 4 and 10 minutes on a subject on light. So yeah, I think the last one that just went live was why you need to get fat during the summer. So you can take a look at that, and we talk about very different things related to light. We post some of the studies in there as well, if there's study supported topics, or if they're just theories. They make for very interesting reading, and I answer all the comments on there myself as well. So we're typically getting quite a lot of people tune in to those, which is great. So that's just on YouTube. It's just the BLUBlox channel. Just type in BLUBlox, and they're all videos of me talking about light. So if you want to learn more, there's some good nuggets there.
Awesome, man. Well, I hope that you and I can connect and cross paths somewhere that has some pretty strong sun soon.
Definitely. As soon as they let me out of Australia in the next 18 months, I'll be over for sure.
Sounds great, brother. All right.